"I can't understand what's happening in his mind, this is beyond psychology," whispered 41-year-old sports psychologist Dr. Rachel Kim as she stared at the brain scan results displayed on her computer screen at 1:30 a.m., her coffee growing cold as she tried to comprehend the neurological patterns that defied every known principle of cognitive science and mental performance. For the past 7 months, Rachel had been conducting the most comprehensive psychological analysis ever attempted on an elite athlete, using advanced neuroimaging, cognitive testing, and behavioral assessment to understand the mental foundations of Shai Gilgeous-Alexander's extraordinary consistency and performance under pressure. But every test Rachel administered revealed cognitive patterns and neural activity that existed outside the normal parameters of human psychology, suggesting that Shai's mind operated according to principles that current psychological science couldn't explain or predict. What Rachel didn't know was that her inability to map Shai's mental processes would lead to groundbreaking discoveries about human consciousness and cognitive potential, revolutionizing how psychology understood the relationship between mental architecture and peak performance. But let me take you back to where this psychological mystery began, because the story of how one athlete's mind broke the boundaries of cognitive science starts with a perfectionist psychologist who believed that all mental performance could be understood, measured, and optimized through rigorous psychological analysis and evidence-based interventions. The date was October 3, 2023, and Dr. Rachel Kim sat in her research office at the Thunder Performance Psychology Institute, preparing for what she expected would be a fascinating but scientifically routine assessment of Shai Gilgeous-Alexander's mental approach to basketball excellence. At 41 years old, Rachel had spent the past 16 years establishing herself as one of the world's leading experts in sports psychology, working with Olympic champions, professional athletes, and military special operations personnel to understand and optimize the mental skills that enabled peak performance under extreme pressure. Rachel's approach to sports psychology was grounded in rigorous scientific methodology and the belief that mental performance, like physical performance, could be broken down into measurable components that could be analyzed, understood, and systematically improved through targeted psychological interventions. Every aspect of mental performance has psychological foundations that can be identified and enhanced, Rachel would explain to the athletes she worked with. When we understand exactly how your mind processes pressure, manages focus, and responds to adversity, we can develop mental training protocols that give you significant competitive advantages. This philosophy had made Rachel incredibly successful in helping athletes overcome performance anxiety, develop unshakable focus, and maintain consistent excellence even in the most high-pressure situations. She had created mental training programs that reduced performance anxiety by 60%, improved focus consistency by 45%, and enhanced decision-making speed and accuracy under stress. When the Thunder organization approached Rachel about conducting a comprehensive psychological assessment of Shai's mental performance, she was excited about the opportunity to study the cognitive architecture that supported his remarkable consistency and clutch performance. Shai represents the perfect case study for understanding how elite mental performance enables sustained athletic excellence, Rachel told her research team when outlining the project. His ability to maintain the same level of focus and decision-making quality regardless of game situation or external pressure suggests psychological skills that we can analyze and potentially teach to other athletes. Rachel planned to conduct the most thorough psychological analysis of her career, using advanced neuroimaging, cognitive testing, personality assessment, and real-time mental performance monitoring to create a complete psychological profile of how Shai's mind functioned during high-level competition. However, what Rachel discovered during their first session would begin a journey that challenged every assumption she had made about human psychology and the cognitive foundations of extraordinary performance. Rachel's initial assessment of Shai took place in her laboratory, surrounded by sophisticated brain monitoring equipment, cognitive testing stations, and psychological evaluation tools that could measure everything from attention patterns to stress responses to decision-making processes under pressure. Shai, I'd like to start by understanding your current mental approach to basketball and any specific psychological challenges or goals you'd like to address, Rachel began, expecting a typical athlete response about managing pressure or maintaining confidence. Instead, Shai's answer revealed a level of psychological self-awareness and mental sophistication that immediately caught Rachel's attention. Dr. Kim, I've been studying psychology and neuroscience for several years, and I've become curious about whether there are mental states and cognitive approaches that could support performance levels that go beyond normal psychological parameters, Shai explained. I'm interested in exploring whether consciousness and mental focus can be developed to access capabilities that most people don't realize they possess. Rachel was impressed by Shai's sophisticated understanding of psychology, but what he said next would begin to reveal the unprecedented nature of the challenge she was about to face. I've been monitoring my own mental states very carefully during games and practices, and I've noticed that my most effective performances seem to come from a state of consciousness that feels different from normal awareness, Shai continued. I'm wondering if there are psychological approaches that could help me access and maintain these optimal mental states more consistently. Rachel had worked with many athletes who talked about flow states and optimal performance zones, but she had never encountered someone who spoke about consciousness and awareness with such precision and depth. Shai, when you describe these optimal mental states, can you be more specific about what feels different about your consciousness during these experiences? Rachel asked, genuinely intrigued by his psychological vocabulary. Shai's response would reveal that he was asking Rachel to explore psychological territory that existed at the very edges of what cognitive science understood about human consciousness and mental performance. During my best performances, it feels like my mind is processing information at a much faster rate while simultaneously being completely calm and present, Shai explained. I can see patterns in the game that aren't visible to normal awareness, anticipate events before they happen, and make decisions that feel like they're coming from a deeper intelligence than my conscious thinking. Rachel realized that Shai wasn't just describing advanced focus or concentration, he was describing states of consciousness that sounded more like what was reported by advanced meditation practitioners or people who had undergone profound consciousness-altering experiences. What you're describing sounds like you're accessing levels of awareness that go beyond normal athletic psychology, Rachel observed. These sound more like altered states of consciousness than conventional mental performance skills. Shai nodded. Exactly. I'm not just trying to be mentally stronger or more focused. I'm trying to understand what's possible when consciousness itself becomes optimized for peak performance. This conversation marked the beginning of Rachel's most challenging and ultimately revolutionary project, understanding the relationship between consciousness, mental architecture, and extraordinary human performance. However, what Rachel discovered when she began analyzing Shai's brain activity and cognitive patterns would reveal just how far beyond normal psychological parameters his mental functioning actually operated. Over the following weeks, Rachel conducted the most comprehensive psychological and neurological assessment she had ever performed. She used advanced fMRI imaging to study Shai's brain activity during various cognitive tasks, measured his attention patterns and information processing speed, and monitored his neurological responses during simulated high-pressure situations. The results challenged everything Rachel thought she knew about human psychology and cognitive performance. This is unlike any brain activity patterns I've seen in 16 years of sports psychology research, Rachel noted as she reviewed Shai's neuroimaging results. His brain shows activity in regions and connectivity patterns that suggest cognitive processing that operates differently from normal human psychology. Rachel's analysis revealed that during optimal performance states, Shai's brain showed increased activity in areas associated with heightened awareness, pattern recognition, and what neuroscientists called global workspace integration, the brain's ability to synthesize information from multiple sources simultaneously. Most athletes show increased activation in specific brain regions during peak performance, Rachel documented in her research notes. But Shai's brain shows coordinated activation across multiple systems in ways that suggest consciousness integration that I've never observed before. But what challenged Rachel even more was that Shai's cognitive testing results exceeded the parameters of every psychological assessment tool she had available. His information processing speed is in the 99.9th percentile, his attention sustainability is beyond measurable limits, and his ability to maintain optimal performance under stress shows psychological resilience that exceeds our testing capabilities, Rachel observed. Rachel realized that she wasn't just studying an athlete with excellent mental skills, she was working with someone whose consciousness operated according to principles that pushed the boundaries of what psychological science considered possible. But the real breakthrough would come when Rachel discovered that Shai's extraordinary mental performance wasn't just natural talent, it was the result of consciousness development practices that he had been cultivating for years. During one of their sessions, Shai revealed that he had been studying meditation, consciousness research, and contemplative practices since his teenage years, developing mental training methods that went far beyond conventional sports psychology. I realized early in my career that the difference between good and great wasn't just physical or technical, Shai explained. It was about accessing levels of awareness and consciousness that most athletes never explore. Shai described meditation practices that he had adapted specifically for basketball performance, breathing techniques that enhanced cognitive function during games, and awareness exercises that helped him access what he called expanded consciousness during competition. What you've developed sounds more like consciousness training than sports psychology, Rachel observed, fascinated by the sophistication of Shai's mental development approach. That's exactly what it is, Shai replied. I believe that peak performance comes from consciousness that's been developed and optimized, not just from mental skills that are applied during competition. This revelation led Rachel to begin studying contemplative psychology, consciousness research, and the intersection of spiritual practice and human performance, fields that were rarely integrated with conventional sports psychology. However, what Rachel discovered when she began incorporating consciousness development principles into her psychological training programs would revolutionize her understanding of mental performance and human potential. Rachel developed what she called consciousness-based performance psychology, an approach that treated mental training not just as skill development, but as consciousness expansion that could access levels of awareness and cognitive function that conventional psychology didn't address. Her new programs included meditation practices adapted for athletes, breathing techniques that enhanced neural coherence, and awareness exercises that helped athletes access the same optimal consciousness states that Shai had been cultivating for years. We're not just training mental skills, Rachel explained to her research team. We're developing consciousness itself as the foundation for sustained peak performance. When Rachel began testing her consciousness-based approaches with other elite athletes, the results exceeded even her optimistic expectations. Athletes reported not just improved focus and stress management, but enhanced creativity, faster learning, more consistent access to flow states, and what many described as seeing the game from a higher perspective. The athletes who learn consciousness development don't just perform better, Rachel documented in her research findings. They access capabilities that they didn't know they possessed. But what happened when Rachel published her research on consciousness and athletic performance would demonstrate that Shai's mental approach had implications that extended far beyond sports psychology. Rachel's paper, titled Beyond Mental Skills: Consciousness Development as the Foundation for Peak Human Performance, was published in the Journal of Applied Psychology and immediately generated discussion among researchers, athletes, and consciousness specialists around the world. Dr. Kim has identified psychological principles that challenge our understanding of human cognitive potential, explained Dr. Michael Torres, a consciousness researcher at Harvard University who peer-reviewed Rachel's work. Her research suggests that what we consider peak mental performance is actually just the beginning of what becomes possible when consciousness itself is systematically developed. Rachel's consciousness-based psychological approaches were adopted by Olympic training programs, professional sports teams, and even meditation centers who recognized that the principles she had developed could enhance performance and well-being in any context requiring sustained excellence. Rachel's work demonstrated that the mental training most athletes receive barely scratches the surface of what's possible, noted Olympic sports psychologist Dr. Sarachin. When you train consciousness rather than just mental skills, capabilities emerge that conventional psychology never addresses. Rachel was invited to speak at psychology conferences, meditation retreats, and consciousness research symposiums about the implications of her work for understanding human potential and mental development. What Shai taught me is that the mind is capable of much more than conventional psychology recognizes, but only when consciousness itself becomes the object of development rather than just the tool for performance, Rachel explained during one of these presentations. But the most meaningful outcome of Rachel's work would be its impact on how psychological training was approached across different fields and applications. Within 2 years of Rachel's initial research with Shai, her consciousness-based approaches were being used by professionals across various fields: surgeons who needed sustained focus during complex operations, executives who required clarity during high-stakes decision-making, students who wanted enhanced learning capacity, and artists who sought consistent access to creative flow states. Rachel's work showed us that consciousness development isn't just relevant for spiritual seekers or meditation practitioners, explained performance researcher Dr. James Liu. It's the foundation for optimal human functioning in any context that requires sustained excellence. Rachel was promoted to Director of Consciousness and Performance Research at the Thunder Organization and established the world's first research institute dedicated to studying the intersection of consciousness development and human performance optimization. What started as a psychological assessment of one athlete became a comprehensive understanding of how consciousness development can unlock human potential across all areas of life, Rachel said during the Institute's opening ceremony. 3 years after her initial confusion about Shai's psychological assessment results, Rachel published a book titled The Conscious Performer: How Awareness Development Unlocks Human Excellence, that became required reading in psychology, performance coaching, and consciousness studies programs. During her book tour, Rachel would always reference her initial amazement at Shai's cognitive test results and how they had led to discoveries that transformed her understanding of human psychology. Shai's mind didn't just operate differently from other athletes, Rachel would explain during interviews. It operated according to principles that conventional psychology didn't even recognize as possibilities. Rachel's research had demonstrated that when someone's mental performance exceeded current psychological understanding, it often meant they were accessing levels of consciousness that could be studied, understood, and developed in others. Years later, when young psychologists asked Rachel for advice about building innovative careers in mental performance, she would always tell them about the night she realized that Shai's brain scans were showing her the future of human consciousness research. The most important lesson I learned is that extraordinary mental performance isn't just about having superior cognitive abilities, Rachel would explain. It's about developing consciousness to access capabilities that all humans possess but few people learn to activate. And in her laboratory, Rachel kept her original psychological assessment of Shai alongside her current consciousness development protocols, with a note she had written to herself. The minds that can't be understood with current psychology are often showing us what psychology could become. The psychologist who couldn't read Shai's mind had discovered that her analytical failure was actually evidence of the most important breakthrough in consciousness research, and that the athletes whose mental performance seems impossible to explain are often the ones who reveal new frontiers of human psychological potential. But Rachel's journey with Shai was far from over. 9 months after her initial assessment, Shai returned with a request that would push Rachel's understanding of consciousness and performance to its absolute limits. Dr. Kim, the consciousness development work we've done has been incredible, Shai said during their follow-up session. But I've been wondering about something even more comprehensive. Is it possible to develop consciousness to the point where mental performance becomes not just consistent, but continuously evolving, where awareness itself becomes a platform for ongoing growth rather than just sustained excellence? Rachel stared at Shai, realizing that he was asking her to explore consciousness development as a dynamic, self-improving system rather than just a stable state of optimal performance. You're talking about consciousness that doesn't just access peak performance, but that actively enhances its own capabilities over time, Rachel said slowly. That would require understanding awareness as a living, evolving system rather than just a tool for improved function. Shai nodded. I believe that consciousness development has no limits, that awareness can continue expanding and evolving indefinitely, creating possibilities that we can't even imagine from our current level of understanding. This conversation would launch Rachel into the most revolutionary phase of her career, researching what she would eventually call evolutionary consciousness development. Over the following year, Rachel expanded her research beyond conventional psychology and neuroscience to study developmental psychology, systems theory, and even contemplative traditions from around the world that had explored consciousness evolution for thousands of years. What Shai was asking for required me to think about consciousness not as a fixed capacity that could be optimized, but as an evolving system that could continuously transcend its own limitations, Rachel explained to her expanded research team, which now included developmental psychologists, systems theorists, and contemplative scholars. Rachel's evolutionary approach led to consciousness development protocols that included practices for expanding awareness beyond current limits, techniques for cultivating what she called metaconsciousness, awareness of awareness itself, and methods for fostering continuous psychological growth rather than just stable performance. We weren't just training consciousness for peak performance, Rachel reflected. We were developing consciousness as a platform for ongoing human evolution. The results of Rachel's evolutionary consciousness program exceeded even her most ambitious expectations. Shai reported not just maintained excellence, but continuous enhancement of his capabilities, faster learning, deeper insights, more creative problem solving, and access to levels of awareness that seemed to expand his potential rather than just utilizing it. It's like my consciousness has become a tool for its own development, Shai told Rachel. Each level of awareness that I develop creates the foundation for accessing even higher levels. But what happened when Rachel began sharing her evolutionary consciousness research with the broader scientific community would reveal that Shai's extraordinary mental development had implications for understanding human potential across all areas of life. Rachel's evolutionary consciousness approaches attracted attention from researchers studying human development, educational psychology, and even fields like artificial intelligence and systems theory that were interested in self-improving systems. Rachel's work suggests that consciousness evolution isn't just relevant for individual performance enhancement, explained developmental researcher Dr. Maria Santos. It's a model for how human potential itself can continue expanding beyond current limitations. Rachel's research led to the establishment of consciousness development programs in educational institutions, corporate training environments, and personal development organizations that wanted to explore the frontiers of human psychological evolution. What started as sports psychology research became a comprehensive model for human consciousness development that has applications far beyond athletic performance, Rachel said during a keynote address at the International Conference on Consciousness Studies. 5 years after first meeting Shai, Rachel was recognized as a pioneer in consciousness research and was invited to establish the world's first academic department dedicated to studying consciousness evolution and human potential development. During the department's inaugural lecture, Rachel reflected on how her work with one athlete had led to discoveries that were transforming multiple fields of human knowledge. Shai taught me that consciousness isn't just a tool for better performance, Rachel explained to the assembled researchers and students. It's the foundation for ongoing human evolution, the capacity through which we continue expanding what's possible for human beings to achieve and become. Rachel's work had demonstrated that when someone's consciousness operated beyond current psychological understanding, it often meant they were pioneering levels of awareness that could become accessible to others through systematic development. In her final reflection on her journey with Shai, Rachel wrote, "The greatest discovery in psychology isn't a new technique or theory, it's the recognition that consciousness itself can evolve, and that this evolution is the key to unlocking human potential that we're only beginning to understand." The story of Rachel and Shai had become more than just a case study in sports psychology. It had become a roadmap for how consciousness development could serve as the foundation for continuous human growth and the ongoing expansion of what human beings are capable of achieving. Years later, when both Rachel and Shai reflected on their collaboration, they agreed that their work together had been about much more than basketball performance or psychological optimization. It had been about discovering the role that consciousness development could play in human evolution itself. "Rachel didn't just help me understand my mind," Shai said during a joint presentation at a consciousness research conference. "She helped me understand that mind, consciousness, and awareness are platforms for ongoing growth rather than fixed capacities. That understanding has implications for every area of human development." Rachel nodded. "And Shai didn't just challenge my psychological knowledge. He showed me that consciousness research isn't just about understanding what humans can do, it's about understanding what humans can become." Working with him taught me that the most important discoveries in psychology come from studying people who are already evolving beyond current limitations. Their collaboration had proven that extraordinary consciousness and rigorous scientific study could enhance each other in ways that revealed possibilities for human development that neither conventional psychology nor individual practice could achieve alone, and that the most important frontiers in human potential were found not in what people could currently do, but in what consciousness could learn to become.